welcome to 497B and 495B, Sustainable Business, Sustainable Economies, Responsibility, Resilience, and Innovation. For today's conversation, by the way, my name is Ben Packard. For those of you who are online, welcome. Nice to be with you all today. We are in for a treat with Charlie Donovan, Professor of Practice in the Foster School of Business, joining us for today's conversation. He is also a senior economic advisor at Impact Asset Management. I'll tell you a little bit about what that is. But he's done some really interesting things. He served as the executive director of the Imperial College of London's Center for Climate Finance and Investment. He's worked in different sectors. If you aren't connected with him, try and connect with him on LinkedIn. He posts very provocative, interesting conversations that I learn from every time. And we're thrilled to have you. So please join me in welcoming Charlie today. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So we have 40 minutes together, and what I thought I would do is try to bring you into a conversation, about what's happening in the environmental space as I see it, but in capital markets. So that's probably maybe a shift for some of you. That's not maybe something that you do. Anybody here is a business major? No. Yes. Econ. Okay, good. And you are? Okay, super. We'll try out some stuff here. And everybody else is more environmental science kind of background. Yeah. So when you think of business and investors, what are the first words that come to mind? For those of you that aren't in econ or finance, does that sound interesting, uninteresting? Profit. Okay. There's a word we hear a lot. What else? What other words kind of come to mind? Yeah. Impact investing, which is a very specialized, very interesting field that for those of you that are interested in environmental stuff could be very interesting. We'll talk about that. Let me write that down so that we come back and talk about what that is. Impact. Yes.
Distribution of resources.
In what way? What's that mean for you?
My first thought is people.
Say again?
My first thought is people in that regards.
Okay. So when I say business or investors, you think distribution of resources and people.
I'm more econ oriented. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm following you, the unit of analysis being how people do, why they do things, and why they choose to buy apples instead of oranges. Yep, for sure. That's part of it. So I'm just going to call that economical managing resources. Good. What else? First thing that comes to mind. I say business. I say investing. Yeah.
Finance.
Okay. Good. Well, these are all good terms. Good. What else? You have a positive impression about that or a negative impression about that? You can say negative. I'm not going to feel bad about mine. So you have a positive or negative? That's something you would think there's something you might have to do as a career, or you're no, that's the exact kind of thing I don't want to do. But
mixed, very mixed. I feel like it's very convoluted from an outside perspective. What that means is a day-to-day.
Okay. What does it actually mean? Okay, that's good. That's really good. So let me tell you what it means to me on the day-to-day. So I worked for a big when I went to the UW, my husband. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't know what exactly I wanted to do. I wanted to actually what I wanted to do is I wanted to get out of school as fast as possible. That was what my goal was at that time. And I wanted to go to work on Wall Street. I don't know why. I think I'd watched that. There's a movie in the 80s called Wall Street. I've watched that too many times, and I thought that's for me. I love that whole slick back hair thing, and you looked like you were kind of master of the universe. And really fortunately, I took a time out from school and then ended up having a few experiences in nature in Utah and then Alaska. And I was like, well, wait a second, maybe that's a little too narrow for me. And so I went to work. I thought I would go to work in New York. That was my big dream, make it big in New York. But instead I kind of changed. I was like, well, what about Washington, D.C.? So I went to work for the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington. And started working on this thing called climate change. And I didn't even know, I probably couldn't spell climate change at the time, but I got super lucky that there was this group that was doing these things, and they were are you interested? And I was like, sure. And next thing you know, I'm in this amazing place and time in which the Kyoto Protocol, you guys have all heard of the Kyoto Protocol? When that was being negotiated. It was a real amazing entry point for me for the rest of my career. And now it's kind of come full circle, which is I've always continued to be interested in financial markets and somehow found a way to combine them both. And that's been really a real blessing for me, something that I probably couldn't have dreamed to do when I was sitting in your shoes. So first thing I want to leave you with today is whatever I want to do is absolutely possible. Absolutely possible. And whether that's combining something that doesn't seem, when I went to business school, the idea that you would go with an environmental interest and like a financial interest, that was like, I remember the career counselor saying, I'm not so sure about that one. Well, maybe you want to kind of think that through. Like we got marketing, we got, environmental finance. I can remember kind of her face. She was like confused what I was saying. But it's turned out it's possible. It's really possible. And so when I think about business and I think about investing today, this a couple of these things that like this thing about impact investing is probably like one of the biggest issues around right now. Why? Because these two things continue to fit together. Just like I think environmental and finance or green economics or anything, those two aren't supposed to fit together. They're not. Because there's an idea, a very old idea, that you really don't do one or the other. How many people have heard of an economist called Milton Friedman? How many, just raise your hand. How many people have heard of him? So the econ people. So tell us what little you know about who Milton Friedman was. Yeah, just thought he was an awful person. That's so interesting. Yeah. And you? Any questions? No. Oh, okay. So Milton Friedman is, probably one of the most famous macroeconomists in the U.S. And he has this really famous quote. And I didn't share this article with you, but I kind of toyed with it. That's in the New York Times from this is like the late 70s. And the famous quote out of this editorial by Milton Friedman, who had, consulted for the White House, was a well-known academic. And his famous words that have reverberated through history over the last 50 years is that the social responsibility of business is to maximize profits. That's the social responsibility of business. So that's why you get some people like this guy. If he just hadn't existed, who knows what the world could have been like. But you have to go back a little while. So I really encourage you to look that up. Okay, Milton Friedman, New York Times editorial. I'm sure it'll be the first thing that comes up on Google. But what he was saying, you have to go back to the time at which he said it. This is the late 70s. We're coming into a period where there's a Cold War, communism, capitalism, and big forces playing against each other. And the idea is that you shouldn't have anybody's social agenda being dictated to commerce or free enterprise, or whatever word you want to kind of create for that, for business. And some part of that I think resonates for all of us is that because if you could do it for positive things, then you could do it for negative things too. And so where you see, state-directed businesses, state-owned enterprises, part of the biggest challenge we have right now in climate change, with climate and an energy transition. Yes, Exxon's a problem, but even a bigger problem is PetroChina or Petrobras or state-owned enterprises that actually have no source of feedback or no source of responsibility to a broader set of stakeholders. They have responsibility to their government, and that's it. That's it. And they're telling them what to do. And so we actually have a luxury. You might hate Exxon. I've never been a big fan of the company itself. But at least they exist in an environment in which they can be influenced by their shareholders, their bondholders, civil society, NGOs, and then by governments, of course. So when Friedman said this, it's kind of at a time in which there's a battle going on about, how involved should the state be in deciding what it is that companies do. And he comes up with this, axiom, or this, proposition that if companies will just focus on what it is that makes profits, they just focus on that, everything else will kind of work out. Everything else will work itself out. So what's the problem with that? I mean, it's very simple. It's nice. It's neat. You just, okay, my job is this, maximize profit. What's the problem with that from your point of view? Yeah.
Doesn't maximize equity or equality.
Max, say that one more time.
It doesn't maximize equity or equality.
Okay, so you were saying that, okay, that's a really good one. It says we're gonna do that, almost kind of comma, what we're hearing is no matter what the consequences are. That can be right. He did have, so he addressed this kind of later in the article, he said, but of course, they should do that within the bounds of law. So maximize, not do that illegally, of course, within the bounds of law. And so the second part of that argument, which has continued to be very strong, and you probably see this in the way that people, come to issues like climate change or equality or whatever the topic is that it's whose job is it to make those laws? It's in this country, it's Congress, or it's the state legislature, or it's the mayor, or whoever it is. And we vote for those people. We vote for those people. So part of his argument is that if you can't exert the political influence to get the laws to change, you shouldn't be sort of by a small committee of individuals deciding what it is that business should do. Now, I don't know about that myself. I'm a little less keen on that one. I'm not sure that we have a political process that's fully representative and gives us a chance to do that. But it's a very powerful sort of narrative that we'll fall into, which is, hey, you don't like it? Go change the laws. So the idea that he's presenting us is with, okay, so within the bounds of law, you need to do this one thing. What else do you not like? Now that we've rounded this out just a little bit more, what still remains is kind of problematic for you about that as a guiding principle for how businesses should operate. Yeah.
Businesses are able to lobby politicians with the profit they make.
That's
how
true.
am I supposed to compete with them?
Right. So you've got this idea that sort of, government's here and business here, and here we are as consumers, and there's no kind of intersection of the Venn diagram. Of course, we know that's not true. We know that there's a big money trail that goes from one to the other. When I first started working in Washington, D.C., somebody said to me, there's like an old joke in Washington, there's two things you never want to get seen made: sausage and government policy. Because it's the ugliest thing to see, which is there's this famous street, K Street in Washington, D.C., and boy, is there a lot of money that flows from there into, it's not overt corruption, doesn't come cash rebases, but it's certainly, particularly as things have changed as a result of certain Supreme Court decisions, there is a huge volume of money, and the political process is increasingly captive to that. Okay, so I think that's really fair. What else? What else would we like about this dictum? Yeah.
It kind of shucks all responsibility off of the companies, and if they're not responsible, then who is?
Okay, so because if you have a situation, this is my experience is so here's government, here's companies, and here's consumers or voters, whichever you want to, people, us. So what's the most, when it comes to climate, what's the roundabout we're always doing? Government says, well, we can't do it that way because people won't vote for it. And the people say, well, it's because the companies don't give me the stuff that I would, but companies don't provide those services. And the companies say, well, we would do that, but the government will, and we just go round and round and round. So at some point, somebody's got to take everybody has to, the only way out of that is instead of passing the buck, everybody takes responsibility. So you would think that there is some point we get to where you say, okay, not your job entirely, but neither is it your job to just push off and say somebody else. I like that. What else? Yeah.
Negative externalities.
That's one I was hoping we'd come to. Okay, so what's it in economics? What's an externality?
It's like something that the company or the firm is not paying for, and so society pays it.
Great. Okay, so you have some mode of production. Okay, I'm gonna come out, now, price quantity. Okay, so the economics, this is the most basic insight into microeconomics. You know, here's one that you're just playing with constantly a supply curve and a demand curve. Supply curve and a demand curve. And where supply and demand meet, that's where you assume that, you know, there's a price that gets set and there's a quantity that will be supplied. Yeah. So an externality is the idea that you're supplying something at basically a cost that's artificially low. Why? Because, so let's just think about oil. A negative externality starts with the idea that, okay, so imagine the simple kind of setup is where you have somebody who lives next to a power station, coal-fired power station, and they have the whitewash that they've got to do. This was obviously a metaphor that came out like in the 50s and 40s. Okay, so you put out the whitewash and it's there to dry, but of course the coal-fired power station blowing downwind and all your white clothes get dirty again. The coal-fired power station is benefiting because actually it would to not create that impact on some individual, it would cost them. They have to put in scrubbers, filters, or whatever they have to do. So it becomes a benefit to the producer to be able to not have that scrubber or filter. But the cost, instead of them paying it, is paid downwind by the person who's going to wash their laundry again. You can quantify that. How much water, how much soap, how much person's time. So a negative externality is anytime somebody is pushing a cost of production onto society as a large or some group overall. So you can have positive externalities as well too. Like if you flip that around, what would be a positive externality? There's a lot of going on right now. I just came from I went past, there was the sweetest smelling gardens as I came along 16. I benefited, I didn't put a cent into it. Somebody who's planted their garden, done all that work, those things are, you know, not cheap to plant those beautiful rose bushes, and I benefited. So you can have positive externalities too. Somebody pays, I benefit. Okay, so anytime we can think about positive, negative, but in economics, externalities are always where whatever's happening in that intersection of supply and demand, it has been shaped by the idea that somebody paid, somebody benefited, or the other way around. All right, so it's actually very much when you go and you go up to Foster and you talk to economic investors about climate change, they're like, oh, that's a really simple problem to solve. Like, really? Jeez. Okay. They're like, just put a carbon tax. I mean, it's just an externality. All you have to do is fix the externality and it'll solve itself. It's a good idea. I think we've been trying to do that for 30 years, so I'm not sure like what's the next step? And they're like, well, I gotta get back to the graded papers. Okay? So, but it's a very powerful moment. Okay, so and the reason I kind of where I want to go next with just this talk is that the idea or the guiding principle for businesses to just focus on their own profitability, there are many shortcomings, which you've all mentioned, but from a pure kind of economic rational perspective, the obvious shortcoming is in the 1970s, maybe we just weren't aware of how many negative externalities were getting created. And the simplistic thing will just fix them, just put the tax on and it'll sort itself out, has proved in the political economy to be nearly impossible. Nearly impossible. Certainly not, I mean, we've made big strides. So you all will be, maybe you would have read about this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act. People are familiar with that? Big change. Europe has a carbon emissions trading system. China has a carbon emissions trading system. So it's like getting there. But over the course of my career, we've been getting there like just slowly, and then going backwards and then moving again and back. And that just doesn't fit the timeline that we have to do something meaningful in terms of reducing risks of climate change. Okay, so part one, we see, when we think about business and we think about investing, we have this, in some ways, bifurcation. The mentality has been to just compartmentalize impact from investing or environmental from finance. These are just separate things. I think one of the big shifts that's happening is people are finally beginning to accept that there is some level of responsibility. Because the world doesn't work like the economist model thought it should. And it's much messier, it's much more difficult. People react, and don't do things that their model says it should. Okay, so where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? The article that I sent to you was for me. Everybody had a chance to read this Wall Street Journal article? Really bad newspaper, but has the occasional sort of bright light that they allow through. So the gist of the article, Al Gore, former vice president, and David Blood, who was the CEO of Goldman Sachs's asset management business, got together and founded this firm called Generation Investment Management. And they had this proposition they were putting out there that we're suffering so badly from this old narrative, and we are going to increasingly suffer from it. Air pollution, climate change, biodiversity, on and on, not to mention all the social issues that go under the rubric of sustainability. That it would be something would happen. It's inevitable that something's got to change. There's an inevitability about that. And that they would set up an investment firm that would seek to invest in those companies that would benefit from the inevitable shift towards a more sustainable economy. And the article I sent you is about what I would call sort of, so that worked for a while. People were like, well, that's great. They're doing that kind of thing. Nobody really cared. They're like, well, some people are going to do that. Some people are not going to do that. But in this last year, that whole thing has taken this huge step forward, because suddenly this thing we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing, suddenly is really making a lot of people very mad. And why is that making them mad? Why is that mad? Why is this, this anti ESG? If you've seen anything in the news about that, how do you understand what's going on there? What is this debate about? Why would some people get so fired up about three little letters that were so like a very archaic and niche part of investing, and then suddenly it's front page of the news? What's going on there? Yeah.
Zero might be like political culture.
Okay, so there's clearly something that happened with political culture. So when we think about E and S and G, you could think of it again within this kind of framework of externalities. Okay? You can think of the lack of gender parity in pay as an externality. You could think of a lot of things as just externalities. We want to take an economic mindset towards it. Okay, so environmental and governance investing was born out of what was called the socially responsible investment movement, okay, which is back to this thing about people said, look, it's kind of our job. We can't just keep passing the buck on this kind of stuff. We got to do something for ourselves. And it started with a lot of faith-based investors. So they said, look, it doesn't make sense. We don't want to be invested in tobacco. We don't want to be invested in defense companies. We don't want to be invested in alcohol or gambling. For a long time, there has been an element of the investment market that, okay, Milton Friedman, you guys, you can go do the thing. I just don't want to be invested in. And pretty much people are like, well, fair enough. You can do those. That's right there. Let's do it. And then somehow, in the last year or so, there's this political culture that now, it's like this is and it's really about the S part. It started with the S part. So you could imagine that there were some legitimate differences of opinion about how much investors should be telling companies, or companies should be telling the world how things should look. I don't know, everybody in this room would fall differently on that, but I think we could all agree that a person would have some legitimate concern. Back to the premise that I started with is, if I can tell you, you should have more women, or you should have more racial diversity, or you should have more whatever, then gets a little bit dangerous. The mechanism by which I enforce that, gets a little bit dangerous, because put in different hands, that could be, telling people to do the exact opposite. Okay, so I think we could all say, all right, well, we got to be careful about how we do this, because we're sort of dictating or potentially dictating what people should do. So in my view, this kind of started with sort of quasi-legitimate debate about what's the appropriate, going back to freedom, really. What's the legitimate role and what's the boundaries between companies, governments, and consumers? Okay, so that's been going on, that's been there. And then suddenly it just took off. It just took off. And my own personal view is that the reason it took off is because suddenly the scheme thing, people got a little bit more aware. And the people who don't want to see, you don't see smoke without fire. Right? As the former vice president said, I saw him give a talk. He said, I went to business school in Vanderbilt, Tennessee. He's from Tennessee. So I was like this. He said, if you see a tortoise sitting on a fence post, you can be pretty sure he didn't get that himself. Yeah. That is really kind of metaphor for why did suddenly this break in? It wasn't like that there was a groundswell. If you ask Americans, like, what ESG investing, I think it's like 13% of them even have any idea what you're talking about. So what it got picked up on, in my own impression, is fossil fuel money that said, ooh, here's a really interesting thing. There's this kind of debate going on here. And you could blow some oxygen into that fire and make it look like this is, this is just 2 steps away from communism or whatever you want to kind of, whatever, value, American value you would want read. And it is a very unique American phenomenon, because the firm that I work for is based in the UK, and they, we get on calls and they're like, what is going on with you people? What is going on there? Try to explain it. Well, it's this, or I think it's that. In Canada, I was just at a conference on the East Coast. She's like, this is a pension fund in Canada. What is going on, you people? What is this? Everybody's becoming completely aware, and I really think that it's, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's pretty plain to see that now the transition to a more sustainable economy, and particularly an energy transition, which would go from hydrocarbons towards renewables, is deeply threatening to establish, deeply threatening. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars threatening. And suddenly, what was just this little fight about has turned into a really, really big thing. Okay. And so the article that I sent you was essentially to say, now what do you do? Now you're like an advocate. Let's be honest, I'm an advocate for the environment. I've been an advocate all my life for doing something about climate change, for renewable energy. I worked for a big oil company and was doing renewables in there. That was not, that was good fun. It was hard though, because you had the sense that you were like out of place. You're out of place. So just as we're kind of making progress and we're getting there, all of a sudden this huge blowback comes. And so what argument have we got that we are not just kind of sitting around, as they think, like, it's really fun when you see some of these posts and they're like, yeah, the IPC scientists who are kind of running the world secretly. It's like, if you're an IPC scientist, I tell you they're not, barely can tie their shoes, much less, get like a cabal that's somehow secretly running the world. So this has become, but you have to figure out how you're going to argue out of this corner, because when you get that kind of blowback, and you're suddenly on the defensive, right? Because they own the narrative, they're telling you what, and you've got it, and then you get on, you get invited to go on Bloomberg TV, and they're like, so Charlie Donovan, but is what you do like, communist? And what do you say? What do you say? What do you say to that? It's that, but it's not that far, because of course I've heard doing Fox News interviews, so it's like I say, say where they can be a little bit, but it's not. The subtext is that subtext goes all the way back to freedom, goes all the way back 50 years, which is, are you seeking to somehow subvert the system with some lever of control that's anti-democratic, anti-capitalist, on and on and on. So how would you argue your way out of that corner? It's a tough one to get paid into. Because first thing you want to say is, yeah, but climate change, and they're like, yeah, or about, can't you see these things? And that's a very frustrating, how can you not see what's at stake in what we're trying to do here? How can you not see, the decline of biodiversity? How can you not be looking at the data that shows clearly the relationships that we're talking about? How can you not be concerned about other human beings' lives that would be put at risk from the future that we're getting into? Yeah.
To me, a basic starting point for that argument is putting it into terms that kind of court would understand more. So maybe like risk management in terms of like human resources. If your workforce in developing countries, their water supply is taken out, whatever natural disaster, and they can't work for you anymore.
Yep.
Does that destroy your entire supply chain? That's
Right.
a huge financial risk to you and your stakeholders.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. So that you hit the nail on the head, which is it's about risk. Now, the problem is that, and you could go on with that. So just to build on, to your supply chain, to your employees, to your business, you can just go on and on and on. And that's clear. There's a great argument to be made that this is a risk. And I'd say about 5 years ago, something kind of shifted where this became a conversation about risk. So it's been very positive to see. The problem is that we go all the way back to the externalities, which is that risk what it starts to encourage is, well, okay, so those risks are going to get, and now all I got to do is try to dance around those risks the best that I can. So it's not really embracing the responsibility for sharing in this problem solving. It kind of leads you a little bit into it. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it potentially leads you to a dead end, which is the solution is just be faster than everybody else at getting away from those risks. That's a really good point. What else? How sorry yourself out of this corner that we've gotten ourselves painted into? What can you appeal to? Yeah.
So as their product, I just the exact opposite, because you're bringing a lot more people with your own voice.
Right. Great. So this conference that I was at last week was run by Series, which is, if you're not know, it's like probably the largest business NGO in the US that's focused on these kinds of issues. And there was a rule that the Trump administration changed that said that in your retirement plan, as it stood before Biden came in, they prohibited pension plans, like the ones that I would have as faculty member at the University of Washington, from considering ESG in any of their investment processes. Prohibited. And Biden, logically in my mind, came around and said, no, actually you should, these are risks, and anything that's a risk should be considered by investors. And so we're going to change that because we're going to allow them not force them, allow anyone the possibility to consider whatever they deem to be material risk factors when they come to do that. And people are just crazy about that. That's like, but for me, they're missing the point. It's about what Series, this NGO has done. They have these neat little buttons, and about the freedom to invest. That was a very clever way of turning this around, because what they're saying is, you're trying to this anti-ESG, you're trying to tell me that I can't consider it. And what I'm telling you is that you're going to make every decision you want, but for the people that understand this, they should very well have choice in the way that they invest their pensions that they're going to hopefully live off of when they retire, to steer away from things that they consider to have too much risk. That's really fundamental. So I think that's a great point, and that's something that people are building on, is actually to just flip it around. It's anti-democratic to tell me what I can and can't do. And I was with somebody who kind of had told me a story about being in Wyoming, where there was a bill that was going through in which they wanted to to preserve the coal industry, wanted to ban all renewable development in the state of Wyoming. There's no solar panels, those wind turbines out of here. And surprisingly, and maybe hopefully for those of us that would like to see it go in this direction, there was a real strong reaction from the landowners who said, you can't tell me what to do. So if I want to put up a solar panel, a solar panel. So I do think that there's also hope in there, which is actually now we can start to appeal to something which is also very much an American value or ideal, which is I get to choose. I should be able to choose. And whether you're pro ESG or anti ESG, we could kind of find an line of argument that whatever you might believe, you can't impose that on somebody else. Okay, what else? Yeah.
So how certain are they that investing in ESG is going to create the same amount of returns in the future in a timely manner for people that are getting pensions as say non-ESG stuff?
So the short answer is nobody knows. And you'll find people that argue with, I got all this literature that says that yes, you got all these people that say no. And one of the great things about doing a PhD, if you're going to do one, is you'll learn that you can make science can be manipulated very easily. Very easily. So I can get you a bunch of studies. If I wanted to go make that argument with studies, I got a whole other bunch of studies, I could do the exact opposite. The truth is that nobody knows because we're talking about what's happening in the future. So tell me what's going to happen to oil prices. Tell me what's going to happen to interest rates. Tell me what's going to happen about who wins the 2024 presidential election. All of that will influence whether more ESG minded stocks will outperform or underperform. And so, you know, but trust me, you hear people saying like somehow they know, but they have no idea.
Then I don't understand why they would try to ban it. Is it because they think they're trying to push a more of their agenda instead of actually believing that they're going towards a more sustainable future?
I think that there's, I personally think that it's a fast transition, the kind of fast transition we need to do to meet anything close to the goals of the Paris Agreement is so threatening to establish economic interest that it just is very, you know, there's also an old saying, like, it's really hard to get somebody to understand something that threatens his or her page. And, you know, having worked in the oil and gas industry, I can empathize with that. I can see people who are fabulous people, great community members, and have just, I can't understand why they don't see the climate issue. And I think it's just, you know, there's a mental process that you just kind of can't let that in. Because if you do let that in, it invalidates, or seemingly invalidates. And you know, the truth is, we don't need a lot. I mean, in a world that's going to transition very quickly, we don't need really as many petroleum engineers as we used to. There's a real concern for a lot of people, you know, so I think that there's part of that. It's a en masse kind of psychological phenomenon, which I can't see this happen because it really threatens people's livelihoods. And we should try and put a break on that, but there is going to be some inevitable difficulty there. Yeah.
Because of that, do you think as the workforce ages and like current petroleum engineers and stuff get out and people more focused on renewable and sustainability phase in, do you think there'll be even more rapid change in how this?
Only if you, and I mean collectively you, as the generation you are, begin to exert more political power than you're exerting. It would be what I think what it comes down to, you know, because you cannot, your economic interests are not strong enough yet. So the only other lever you have is political power.
Political power in terms of voting?
In terms of voting, in terms of protesting, in terms of referendums, in terms of all the kind of things that we have, you know, at our disposal to on your senator. I don't know, anybody ever called your senator? This person sitting there right now, well, not right now. There was somebody until 5 o'clock in Senator Murray's office. It's just sitting there waiting to get your phone call, and they're called the legislative aid, and they take down your name and where you're from and what you said is your issue. And that gets then they get, you know, Senator Murray gets a sack of, we had, you know, 1,900 calls today about issue X. Surprisingly, that still sort of moves things. So yeah, there's a lot. Voting is one, but I think there's a more direct, let's say, action is also part of it. Yeah.
When this is a much more scale, when you think about it, just say like a random company wanting to switch over to use renewable energy sources for their retail locations, how do you make that argument when the risk seems so far in the future?
Yeah.
For someone in finance or the, conversation of how successful ESG really is, like, where's that fine line where you make adjustments within like the timeline of the Paris.
So, Mark Carney, who is the former governor of the Bank of England, equivalent to head of the Federal Reserve, gave a speech in 2015 that he talked about this thing called the tragedy of the horizon. So we all know from environmental science, the tragedy of the commons. He said there's a very similar thing with climate, which is the tragedy of the horizon. You'll never, that would be the appropriate role of government to internalize that with a recognition that the lag that is occurring between when we emit and when that impact is felt due to the lag of concentrations in the atmosphere, that creates this unbelievably deep dilemma, which is you can never respond to the risk in real time. And how do you help people understand that we're setting the ground for what the environment is going to be like, at least in terms of climate? I wish I had a great answer for you. And I at least think people are aware of that. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try to impress upon people that these decision-making processes, at least for climate, are not real. Like with a 20 to 30 year lag. And yes, so the cost is today, the benefit is way out in the future, and boy, that's tough. Okay, so I need to, you guys, it's a really nice evening, so I can definitely on time, but the reason I sent you that article, kind of to try to bring it full circle, is around how we get it, trying to argue out of this corner, is around the idea of fiduciary duty. That starts to become what it's, at least in investing, and what it's all about. I have a response, I take in other people's money. This is not my own money I'm playing. This is other people's money. This is the California Teachers Pension Plan. This is the, on and on. And they need to provide money back in turn to their retirees. So they have to be able to try to maximize on a risk adjusted basis the returns that they earn over time as long-term investors. That's fair and that's right. So the idea of the op-ed is that considering these things, which are shaping the world that we're all going to live in, is my responsibility as a fiduciary, as an agent of managing money for other people. And you can think about that as investors, you can think about that as business people, anybody who's in the position of controlling somebody else's resources on their behalf. They have a responsibility. And a very strong argument for me is that we have a responsibility to do that with a recognition of the risks. And you'd be a fool to think that the world is not being shaped in terms of risk by environmental issues. So whether that works, we shall see.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Charles. Please join me. For those of you online, please stick around for a second. Gary has a few announcements about our path forward. But Gary, the floor is yours to speak to our 497.
Yeah. So those of you who are in the honors seminar, we're done for today. Although if you track him down and make him answer things, go ahead and do that. But there are people online for 495 and a few others who actually